Hello, this is a review for Punished by Rewards. I'm hoping to do some more book reviews. As you guys probably know, I'm a voracious reader. I read a book probably every week, and then for this book club, I'm doing a book every 2 weeks. So I've been really enjoying that, and I'd like to sort of have a better way to recall what it is I read and crystallize it down into a few words. Hopefully we'll keep these videos to like 5-10 minutes. But here's everything I thought about this book. First of all, I want to say that the title's a little misleading. He doesn't think rewards are bad. And I think a lot of people who cursorily browse this book, they're going to think that. They're going to think, oh, rewards are punishment. But that's not the case. His thesis is very clearly conditional rewards are implicit punishments. Which means if I say something like, if you don't clean your room, you're not going to get any ice cream, then that's an implicit punishment. I'm saying if you don't clean your room, you're not going to get any ice cream that you would have otherwise had. So that's his thesis, which is a little bit more nuanced and probably wouldn't make as good a title, so it makes sense that he's just said punished by rewards. But in general, he supports reward-based incentive structures with in some conditions, right? There's a lot of caveats on top of that, right? So he does believe, for example, people should be paid for their work. He doesn't think, though, that there should be conditional bonuses based on how many sales you sold and things like that. And my friend did have an interesting counter argument where he was like, what about in these sales-based jobs? So for example, if you get paid a percentage of your work, a percentage of the amount you sell, this is called commissions. How would that fit into the picture? And he doesn't really do a good job of fighting that counter argument. And I would say that the big issue with this book is the editing is really poor. He takes a lot of the interesting stuff and it's way too far in the back to the point that my friend in the book club, he actually stopped reading the book about halfway through because he just got bored. And I will admit the same thing happened to me. I started to tune it out. Now, I'm doing Audible, so I can kind of sort of tune it out and then tune back in. And I was able to do that and sort of stick with it. But I have to say, I just can't recommend the beginning chapters of this book to anyone. I think they're boring. I think the book is a little bit boring, and a really good editor would have been able to help him out here. But I think they failed him in this case. The content's great, but again, the structuring of the story, it needs some improvement. Because the beginning is really just all about the philosophy. He's sort of saying like, rewards are bad, and here's why, blah, 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 blah. And then he's like, and here's an example of why, and here's an example of why. And that example stuff and the counter arguments certainly should have went further in the book. It should have been structured, I think, in such a way of like, here's something I believe, here's a counter argument, and here's why, despite that counter argument, I still believe it. And here's a motivating example as well. That would have been so much more helpful. I would say that his way of storytelling is a little bit between Malcolm Gladwell and the author of How Not to Die. Where Malcolm Gladwell is very narrative-based, Malcolm Gladwell might dedicate a whole chapter to one case study. The other guy in How Not to Die, that book has basically in one chapter, you might have 10 case studies, right? He's rapid fire with all this quantitative data. This guy's a little bit in the middle, and he fails to really get the benefits of either. He doesn't really have a strong storyline pulling him through, and he also doesn't really rely enough on empirical data for you to point to what he's saying and be like, oh, okay, that's backed up, that's backed up. A lot of his points are a little bit like, oh, that's kind of anecdotal, and I don't know if you've really convinced me, which is never a great place to be, I think, with this kind of book. There's also a subplot, which is that there are these big incumbent organizations that sell incentive-based platforms to larger corporations, and that these guys who are trying to sell these incentive programs are evil, and they're coming after him and trying to stop him from talking about how rewards are bad. And so that's mildly interesting, I would say, but it did feel like it was a little bit ponied up, as if it wasn't really as much of a situation as he was pretending, like all these guys are after him, like he's some sort of it's this plot we've seen before, this sort of, women hate him because of this one weird trick, but I don't know if it was particularly compelling from a narrative standpoint or to bolster his arguments. However, you could tell this guy's has been doing this for a while and that he is very brilliant. If the editor's pretty bad, the author's pretty good. And that's because he has these little nuggets that I think you could pull out and just spend a whole video talking about. And I wanted to share with you some of these quotes and my thoughts on them. The first one is, again, a general principle which I would say summarizes this book pretty neatly. And he says, do not roughly move a man when you can softly move a man. Do not softly move do not softly move a man if you can tell him to move. Do not tell a man to move if you can ask him to move. So that's a little bit of a summary. He's not talking about men, though. He's talking about girls, so I've adopted a little bit. Because, again, he does jump around a little bit. Sometimes he's talking about the corporate reward structure, boss to subordinate. Sometimes he's talking about the parental reward structure, parent to child. And there's some interesting thoughts there as well. So I think that'd be interesting to talk about in just a moment. But I think that quote is sort of representative of his general thesis, which is in general, and that's again from his empathetic viewpoint, he's trying to say, hey, if you can, there's a case study where there's this girl and she doesn't want to go to bed early, and people are saying, well, what should you do? Should you punish her? Should you do this? Should you do that? And what he's saying is you got to go to the girl who doesn't want to go to bed early, and you got to say, hey, why don't you want to go to bed early? And he's saying like a clinical psychologist might be able to dive into that, or a therapist, and they might be able to figure out, because maybe there's she had a busy day and she needs time to unwind, or maybe because she's got this pressure from her parents or something like that, right? There's all these other things that could be happening in the household or otherwise in her life that could be affecting that. And so he's saying, when you've got people who are not doing what you want, you've got to zoom out and figure out why. And I think all of that makes sense. So the question really is the reward structure. How's that fit into that? So there's some interesting arguments there. I love this one, though. He says, when we hit our children to punish them, we are implicitly teaching them that it is okay for adults to deal with their frustration through acts of violence. I thought that one was really pertinent. He has that one on corporal punishment, which means punishment by physical harm. And he also has this one. There's a mother, and she says, I did not spank my second kid because I became a better mom. She said, I knew I was becoming a better mother because I spanked my second kid less. Wow, I thought that one was particularly resonant with me because I grew up in a pretty, I guess by today's standards, violent household. My parents would hit me if I misbehaved, and they don't hit my younger brothers that way. It's really changed, and I think that's in line with this zeitgeist of the culture, which is this idea that, maybe corporal punishment is not on the right side of history right now. And I think we've seen a similar progression in the zeitgeist with hitting your wife. Traditionally, in, even, American Anglo-Saxon culture, it was fine for you to hit your wife. There was all these, medical things like how they might believe women have this womanly hysteria. And I remember particularly because it's in some movie, there's a law that said it's okay to beat your wife as long as the stick is, I think, thinner than your thumb and stuff like that. So that all sounds crazy right now. To hit your wife, I think pretty much everybody now would say, okay, that's not okay. At least in, a first, a First Nation country, right? But it's still a little bit, I think, split on if it's okay to hit your kids. Is it okay to hit your kids, And hit has a little bit of variation, right? I mean, what does it mean to hit your wife versus punch your wife versus slap your wife, right? That has changed over time, right? Whereas with your kids, I think we're kind of in the middle of it, right? Whereas like all those things pretty much I think are sort of rejected by society for the wife. But with the kids, I think it's still sort of in many communities okay, and particularly, conservative communities, it's okay for you to spank your children, maybe not to hit them. And what was the other one? I can't remember. Spank, maybe that varies. So I think that's interesting, just to see how that zeitgeist has shifted, is sort of following the, the misogyny, I guess, or just the violence against women. So I think those are both particularly interesting, but frankly irrelevant to the theme of the book, if you're going to be honest, right? The book's about punishments, but there's a lot of, well, I guess it's about rewards, it's about punishments, and corporal punishment is sort of a big part of that. So it's interesting to talk about, how we commit acts of violence to get people to do what we want, and if we do reward structures as well. My friend in the book club, he said, committing an act of violence is way different than a reward-based structure, and I would agree with him there. There's certainly different parallels, but there are many thresholds of I think the same spectrum that we're talking about, which is in general reward and punishment incentivization structures. So I think that's it's all quite fascinating. There's a lot to think about, and I could probably talk about this book for quite some time afterwards. I want to underscore, he's saying money is not a bad reward. It's how you telegraph it. One of the main things he hits upon is, even if you are going to do incentive-based reward structures, something like commissions, you can't wag it in front of people's faces. If you want people to do their best work, you got to say, okay, here's the contract. Here's what the terms we agreed to. And now the contract is settled. Now do your best work, so that people are not constantly worrying about competing with each other, which was a major example when he talked about a law firm where they had incentivization structures that were adversarial in nature. And so when they removed that, suddenly people were doing things for the good of the firm, and that really improved that incentive structure. So there's a few thoughts there. And just in general, talking about how to manage people, how to motivate people. Fascinating stuff. So in total, I would say I would not 100% recommend this book. I would say if you want to read this book, you should jump to the middle and start from there, because the end of the book is so much better than the beginning of the book. I would say out of 5, it's probably a 3 to a 3.5. I'll give it a 3.5. And yeah, at this point, it is a do not recommend from me. Though I do think there's some interesting stuff there, and you'd probably be better if you've listened to the summary. You probably got the gist of what he was saying, minus some of the case studies, and you may be better suited to just get a summary of this book, because I don't know if word for word it's worth it, so to speak. So that's it. That's the summary of this book. I'd love to hear if you read it, what you think about it, and look forward to more reviews like this as I continue to read books. Not like I haven't been reading books before, but I'm trying to review them now, so we'll see how many I can review. All right, I'll catch you guys later. Bye.